The sound of crackling wood wasn't supposed to be there. Annabel Morrison pressed her fingertips against the rough cabin wall, feeling the vibrations travel through the timber like a heartbeat growing faster, more erratic. Something was wrong. The familiar scents of pine and morning coffee had been replaced by something acrid, something that made her throat burn with each breath. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She hadn't seen light in 12 years, but she could feel the heat building behind the walls. Annabel had always trusted her other senses more than most people trusted their eyes. Living alone in the remote Montana wilderness for the past 3 years had sharpened every remaining sense to a razor's edge. She could identify the difference between a chipmunk's scurry and a squirrel's bound from 50 feet away. She knew the exact pitch of wind that meant a storm was coming 6 hours before it arrived. She could tell time by the way shadows changed the temperature on her skin. But this morning, everything felt different. The floorboards beneath her bare feet were warmer than they should be at dawn. The usual symphony of birdsong outside her window had fallen silent, replaced by an odd crackling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Most troubling of all, the air itself tasted wrong, metallic and sharp, like breathing through cloth soaked in kerosene. Annabel moved through her small cabin with the practiced efficiency of someone who had mapped every inch of their world. Her fingers traced along the kitchen counter, finding her way to the wood stove that should have been cold from the night before. Instead, the metal surface radiated heat so intense she jerked her hand back with a sharp intake of breath. The stove was stone cold. The heat was coming from somewhere else. She pressed her ear against the cabin's rear wall, the one that faced the dense forest where she'd never bothered to clear the underbrush. The crackling sound was louder here, more defined. It wasn't the comfortable snap of seasoned firewood in a hearth. This was the hungry, chaotic sound of flame consuming everything in its path. Forest fire. The realization hit her like ice water. She'd heard the old-timers in the nearest town, 40 miles away, talk about how fast wildfires could move through dry timber, how they could jump from treetop to treetop faster than a horse could run, how they consumed everything in their path, leaving nothing but ash and blackened earth. Annabel forced herself to remain calm. Panic would kill her faster than any fire. She moved to her bedroom, pulling on the heaviest boots she owned and grabbing the thick wool coat from its hook by the door. Her emergency pack, something she'd assembled during her first month in the wilderness, sat in the corner where she'd left it 3 years ago. Water, dried food, basic medical supplies, and most importantly, rope. She slung it over her shoulders and felt its familiar weight settle against her back. The heat was growing stronger now, seeping through the cabin walls like an invisible tide. She could hear the fire more clearly, not just crackling anymore, but a low roar that seemed to shake the very air around her. It was close, too close. Annabel stepped onto her front porch and immediately understood the scope of her situation. The wind carried smoke so thick she could taste the burning pitch and cedar. The temperature had risen at least 20 degrees since she'd first woken up. Most telling of all, the ground beneath her feet vibrated with a rhythm she'd never felt before. The trembling footsteps of countless animals fleeing through the forest. She was directly in the path of a major wildfire, alone, with no vehicle, and no way to call for help. The nearest road was 12 miles through dense forest. The nearest neighbor was even farther. She'd chosen this isolated location specifically because she wanted to be left alone and wanted to prove to herself and everyone else that her blindness didn't make her helpless. Now that isolation might cost her everything, but Annabel had spent 3 years learning about this wilderness. She knew something that might save her life. The creek. It ran past her cabin about a quarter-mile to the east, carving a path through the forest toward the distant valley. She'd followed it many times during her daily walks, using the sound of running water as a guide when she ventured farther from home than usual. More importantly, she remembered the old-timer at the general store, telling her that creeks and rivers were often the only thing that could stop a forest fire, or at least slow it down enough for someone to escape. Water didn't burn. If she could reach the creek and follow it downstream, she might be able to stay ahead of the flames until she reached the valley where the terrain opened up and the fire would have less fuel to sustain itself. It was her only chance. Annabelle locked her cabin door out of habit, though she suspected there might not be a cabin to return to. She oriented herself using the morning sun's warmth on her left cheek and began walking east toward the sound of running water that was barely audible beneath the growing roar of approaching flames. The first 100 yards were familiar territory. She'd walked this path countless times, collecting firewood and checking the snares she used to supplement her diet. Her feet found the worn trail automatically, following the slight depression in the forest floor that marked where deer and elk had traveled for generations. But as she moved deeper into the woods, the familiar became strange. The air grew thicker with each step, and the temperature continued to rise. Animals crashed through the underbrush around her. She could hear them panting and whimpering as they fled. A family of raccoons chittered frantically as they scrambled up a tree nearby. Somewhere to her left, a deer bounded past, with such force that she felt the ground shake with each leap. The forest was evacuating itself, and she was running with it. When Annabelle finally reached the creek, the sound of running water had never been more beautiful. She knelt beside the rocky bank and cupped the cold mountain water to her lips, washing the taste of smoke from her mouth. The creek was perhaps 4 feet wide and running fast from recent mountain snowmelt. She could feel the current tugging at her fingers when she dipped them in the water. Perfect. Fast-moving water would lead her downstream quickly, and the moisture in the air around the creek would provide some protection from the heat and flames. She began following the creek downstream, keeping one foot on the rocky bank while the other splashed through the shallow water at the creek's edge. This way, she could feel the water's flow to guide her direction while maintaining better footing than if she tried to walk directly in the streambed. The sound of the fire grew closer behind her. What had started as distant crackling was now a constant roar, punctuated by the explosive crack of large trees falling. The air temperature continued to climb, and Annabelle could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool morning that had greeted her less than an hour ago. She picked up her pace, but forced herself to be careful. A twisted ankle or a fall into the rocky creek bed would be a death sentence. She tested each step, using her hands to feel for obstacles when the terrain became unfamiliar. The creek led her through parts of the forest she'd never explored. The sound of the water changed as it flowed around boulders and fell over small ledges, creating a constantly shifting audio map of her surroundings. She could tell when the forest canopy opened up because the sound echoed differently. She could sense when the creek bed narrowed because the water moved faster and sounded higher pitched. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Annabelle encountered her first major obstacle. The creek curved sharply to the left and the bank on her side disappeared, replaced by what felt like a steep rocky slope that dropped directly into deeper water. She could hear the creek flowing faster here, tumbling over rocks with more force than the gentle babbling she'd been following. She had 3 choices: try to climb around the obstacle through unknown terrain, attempt to cross to the other bank where she couldn't be sure there was safe footing, or wade through the deeper water and hope the current wasn't strong enough to sweep her away. Behind her, the roar of the fire had grown noticeably louder. She could smell burning pine pitch so strongly now that it made her eyes water. The heat on her back felt like standing too close to a massive bonfire. There was no time for careful consideration. Annabel waded into the creek, feeling the cold mountain water rise to her knees, then her waist. The current was stronger than she'd expected, tugging at her coat and threatening to unbalance her with each step. She used her hands to feel along the rocky creek bed, finding purchase where she could and moving slowly but steadily through the deeper water. The creek bottom was treacherous. Smooth rocks made slippery by algae alternated with sharp stones that threatened to cut through her boots. Twice she nearly lost her footing as loose rocks shifted beneath her weight. But the water was blessedly cold against the growing heat in the air, and she could feel the moisture protecting her lungs from the increasingly thick smoke. When she finally reached the far bank, Annabel was soaked to her chest, but still moving. The creek continued winding through the forest ahead of her, and she could hear that the water was moving even faster now as the terrain began to slope more steeply downward toward the distant valley. She resumed her pattern of walking along the bank with one foot in the water, using the creek as her guide through terrain she'd never seen. The forest around her was changing as she moved downstream. The tall pines gave way to a mixture of aspen and birch, and she could tell from the way sound carried that the trees were more spread out here, with clearings between them. This was both good and bad news. The fire would have less fuel in the more open terrain, but she would also have less protection from radiant heat when the flames reached this area. The smoke was getting thicker. Annabel found herself coughing more frequently, and she pulled her wool coat up over her nose and mouth to filter the air. The fabric helped, but she could still taste the acrid burn of countless trees and plants being consumed behind her. She tried not to think about her cabin, about the 3 years of carefully organized life that was probably turning to ash at this very moment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The books in Braille that had taken her months to acquire, the furniture positioned exactly where she needed it, the garden she'd planted and tended, learning through trial and error which vegetables grew well in the mountain soil. All of it was likely gone, and she was alone in the wilderness with nothing but the creek to guide her, and the hope that she could stay ahead of the flames long enough to reach safety. The sound of the fire behind her was changing again. The constant roar had developed an underlying rhythm like breathing. She realized with a chill that this was the sound of the fire consuming oxygen, sucking the air into itself as it burned everything in its path. The rhythm was getting faster, which meant the fire was getting closer. Annabel increased her pace, splashing through the shallow water at the creek's edge, with less concern for quiet movement. Speed was more important than stealth now. The animals had already fled this area anyway. She hadn't heard so much as a bird call in the past 20 minutes. The creek led her around another bend, and suddenly the character of the forest changed. Completely. The air smelled different here, less smoky, with undertones of something she couldn't quite identify. The temperature was still rising, but not as rapidly as before. Most noticeably, the sound of the creek had changed again, echoing off what seemed like rock walls on both sides. She realized she'd entered some kind of canyon or gorge. The creek was cutting through rocky terrain now, and she could hear water falling over stone ledges ahead. This was good. Rocky terrain would provide natural fire breaks, and the moisture from waterfalls would create cooler microclimates that might slow the fire's advance. But it also meant the terrain was about to become much more challenging to navigate. Annabel pressed forward, knowing that the fire behind her wouldn't pause for difficult terrain. Her only choice was to stay with the creek and hope it led her through the rocky area safely. The canyon walls rose on either side of Annabel like stone guardians, their surfaces slick with moisture from the creek's spray. She could feel the temperature drop as she moved deeper into the rocky passage, a blessed relief from the suffocating heat that had been building behind her. The fire's roar became more distant here, muffled by the natural acoustics of the narrow gorge. but the terrain had become treacherous in ways she hadn't anticipated. The creek bed was no longer the gentle, rocky bottom she'd grown accustomed to. Here the water had carved smooth channels through solid stone, creating natural slides and pools that were impossible to judge by sound alone. Twice she stepped forward, expecting shallow water, and instead found herself plunging knee-deep into hidden basins, carved by centuries of rushing snowmelt. The walls of the canyon pressed close enough that she could touch them with outstretched arms, but their surfaces were deceptive. What felt like solid handholds crumbled at her touch, sending loose shale cascading into the water below. Other sections were so smooth they offered no grip at all, polished by countless spring floods into surfaces as slippery as ice. Annabelle forced herself to move methodically, testing each step before committing her full weight. The sound of falling water grew steadily louder ahead of her, suggesting a significant waterfall somewhere in the darkness beyond. She hoped it would prove to be another obstacle she could navigate, rather than an impassable barrier that would trap her in the canyon. With the fire, the smoke overhead was creating strange effects in the narrow gorge. She could feel it settling like a blanket above the canyon rim, but the moisture rising from the creek kept the air at her level relatively clear. It was like walking through a tunnel with clean air at the bottom and poison at the top. As she worked her way through a particularly narrow section where the canyon walls closed to barely 3 feet apart, Annabelle heard something that made her blood freeze. Howling, not the distant howling of coyotes or wolves responding to the fire, but something much closer, something that seemed to be coming from directly ahead of her, from the direction she needed to travel. She stopped moving and listened intently, trying to separate the sound from the constant noise of rushing water. There it was again, a long, mournful call that echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to multiply as it bounced back and forth between the stone surfaces. Wolves. A pack of them by the sound of it. The fire had driven them into the canyon just as it had driven her. Now she was trapped between advancing flames behind her and predators ahead. Wolves fleeing a forest fire would be panicked, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous to anything they perceived as competition for the limited escape routes. Annabelle considered her options. She could try to backtrack, but the fire was still advancing and would likely reach the canyon entrance soon. She could attempt to climb out of the gorge, but the walls were steep and crumbly, and she had no way of knowing if there were safe routes to the rim. Or she could continue forward and hope the wolves were more interested in escape than confrontation. The howling came again, closer this time and answered by several other voices. They were definitely moving in her direction. She resumed walking, but pulled a smooth river stone from the creek bed and gripped it tightly in her right hand. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing if the wolves decided she was a threat. Her left hand found another stone, this one with a sharp edge that could do real damage if necessary. The sound of falling water was getting much louder now, and she could feel a fine mist in the air that told her she was approaching a significant waterfall. The creek's flow had picked up speed as well, tugging more insistently at her boots as she waded through the increasingly swift current. When Annabelle rounded the next bend in the canyon, the acoustic environment changed dramatically. The sound of water was no longer just the babbling of a creek, but a thunderous cascade that seemed to fill the entire space around her. She could feel the vibration through the stone beneath her feet and taste the moisture in the air as droplets settled on her face and hands. She had reached the waterfall. Working her way forward carefully, she used her hands to explore the area around the base of the falls. The creek pooled here in a natural basin perhaps 20 feet across, with the waterfall itself dropping from somewhere high above. She couldn't determine exactly how high, but the force of the water hitting the pool suggested a substantial drop. More concerning was what she discovered along the edges of the pool. paw prints, large ones pressed into the soft mud where the water had recently receded. The wolves had been here, and recently a new sound made her turn toward the canyon wall to her left, scratching. The scrape of claws against stone, accompanied by heavy breathing and the occasional whimper of effort. Something large was trying to climb out of the canyon. The acoustic properties of the gorge made it impossible to pinpoint exactly where the sound was coming from, but it was close, very close. Annabelle made a decision that went against every survival instinct she'd developed over 3 years in the wilderness. Instead of trying to hide or retreat, she started to sing. It was something her grandmother had taught her when she was very young, before the accident that had taken her sight. A simple melody that her Irish ancestors had used to identify themselves to strangers in the hills of County Cork. The tune was designed to carry over long distances and to sound distinctly human, non-threatening, but clearly indicating the presence of a person rather than prey. Her voice echoed strangely in the canyon, bouncing off the walls and mixing with the sound of falling water to create harmonics she hadn't expected. The melody seemed to hang in the air, weaving through the mist and filling the narrow space with something that had been missing since the fire began. Beauty. The scratching sounds stopped. Annabelle continued singing, putting more volume behind her. Voice now that she knew it was carrying well in the acoustic environment. She chose songs her grandmother had taught her, melodies that spoke of home and safety and the basic human need for connection. They were songs meant to be shared, meant to build bridges between strangers who might otherwise see each other as threats. A new sound joined the mix, breathing, heavy, panting breaths that definitely came from something much larger than a human. Multiple things, actually. She could distinguish at least 3 different patterns of respiration coming from various points around the pool. The wolves had found her, but they weren't attacking. They seemed to be listening. Annabelle kept singing, choosing her songs instinctively now, rather than thinking about the words. Her voice found melodies that seemed to fit the natural rhythm of the waterfall, creating a strange duet between human music and the percussion of falling water against stone. She could sense movement around her, not the aggressive stalking she might have expected from cornered predators, but something more like curiosity. Occasional soft footfalls on stone, the quiet splash of something drinking from the pool, and always that steady breathing that told her she was definitely not alone. The smoke above the canyon was getting thicker. She could smell it more strongly now, and the temperature was beginning to rise again as the fire found ways to follow the wind currents down into the gorge. They were all running out of time, her and the wolves alike. Annabelle finished the song she was singing and let the last notes fade away before speaking aloud. "We're all in the same situation here," she said, pitching her voice to carry without being aggressive. "The fire's coming, and we all need to get out of this canyon." The breathing sounds shifted positions slightly, but no growling or other signs of hostility answered her words. She began moving toward what she hoped was the far side of the pool, the side where the creek continued its journey toward the valley. Her progress was slow and careful. The footing around the waterfall was treacherous, with wet stone and hidden drop-offs that could send her tumbling into deep water. The wolves seemed to be following her movements. She could hear them repositioning themselves as she worked her way around the pool, but they maintained their distance. It was almost as if they recognized her as another refugee from the fire, rather than a threat or potential prey. When she reached the outlet where the creek continued downstream from the waterfall pool, Annabelle discovered a new problem. The water here was moving much faster than anything she'd encountered so far, rushing through a narrow channel between high stone walls. The sound told her it was probably knee-deep, but the current would be strong enough to sweep her off her feet if she wasn't extremely careful. Behind her, she could hear one of the wolves testing the same route. A splash, followed by a yelp and the sound of claws scrambling against wet stone. Even the wolves were having trouble with this section. The fire's roar was getting noticeably louder now. Looking up toward the canyon rim, she could see a faint orange glow reflecting off the smoke that hung over the gorge. The flames had reached the canyon's edge and were beginning to work their way down the walls. There was no more time for caution. Annabelle waded into the swift water, immediately feeling the current grab at her legs with surprising force. She used her hands to steady herself against the canyon walls, but the stone was slick with spray from the waterfall and offered uncertain purchase. The water rose to her thighs as she moved deeper into the channel, and the current threatened to lift her feet from the rocky bottom with each step. Behind her, she could hear splashing and scrambling as the wolves followed her into the treacherous passage. The canyon began to widen again after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few hundred yards. The walls spread apart. The ceiling of smoke overhead seemed higher, and most importantly, the creek's current began to slow as the water had more room to spread out. Annabelle emerged from the narrow channel soaked to her waist, but still upright. Behind her, she could hear the wolves shaking themselves off and panting heavily from their own struggle through the swift water. The character of the forest was changing again. She could tell from the way sound carried that the trees were more widely spaced here, and the air smelled different, less of pine and more of the grasses and wildflowers that grew in mountain meadows. She was approaching the valley, but the fire was close behind them now. The orange glow was visible even through her damaged vision, and the heat was building rapidly as flames found fuel in the scattered trees and dry grass of the more open terrain. The wolves seemed to sense the urgency as well. She could hear them, moving more quickly now, no longer the careful, curious pace they'd maintained in the canyon. They were running, and their heavy breathing suggested they were pushing themselves to their limits. Annabelle picked up her own pace, splashing through the shallower water as the creek meandered through what felt like increasingly open country. The sound of her footsteps was different here, less echo, more absorption by soil and vegetation rather than bare stone. A new sound reached her ears from somewhere ahead. At first, she thought it might be another waterfall, but the rhythm was wrong. This sound had a pattern to it, a regularity that spoke of something other than natural water flow. It took her a moment to identify what she was hearing. Drums, rhythmic, purposeful drumming coming from somewhere downstream. The sound was faint but unmistakable, and it seemed to be getting closer, or she was getting closer to it. Human beings. Somewhere ahead of her, people were making music. Annabelle felt hope surge through her exhausted body. She wasn't going to die alone in the wilderness after all. There were people ahead, people who might be able to help her escape the fire that was rapidly consuming everything behind her. She began moving toward the sound of the drums, using them as a beacon, just as she had used the creek to guide her escape from the canyon. The wolves seemed to hear the music too. Their breathing patterns changed, and she sensed them spreading out around her rather than following directly behind. The fire's glow was getting brighter behind them, and she could hear trees exploding. As the flames reached them, whatever fuel the fire had found in the valley grasslands, it was burning fast and hot. The drumming was definitely getting closer. She could begin to make out individual beats now, complex rhythms that spoke of skilled musicians rather than random noise. There were voices too, chanting in a language she didn't recognize, but which sounded oddly familiar nonetheless. As she followed the creek around another bend, Annabelle saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. Light, not the orange glow of wildfire, but the warm yellow flicker of controlled flames. Campfires. She had found the people making the music. The campfires cast dancing shadows that Annabelle could actually perceive through her damaged vision, shapes and movements that told her she was looking at a substantial encampment rather than a few scattered travelers. The drumming had grown complex now, with multiple instruments weaving together in patterns that spoke of ceremony rather than simple music-making. She approached cautiously, aware that stumbling into an unknown group while fleeing a wildfire could create complications she couldn't afford. The wolves had disappeared somewhere behind her, melting back into the darkness as wild animals do when they sense human presence nearby. The chanting grew clearer as she drew closer, and now she could identify the language that had seemed familiar earlier. It was Mandan. She'd heard it years ago from an elderly man who used to visit the general store near her old home in North Dakota. He'd been one of the few remaining speakers of a language that had nearly died out with his generation. These weren't random travelers caught by the fire. This was a deliberate gathering, and she was about to interrupt something important. Annabelle stopped at the edge of what felt like a large clearing, using the creek as her guide to where the encampment began. She could feel the heat from multiple fires warming the air around her, and the sense of cooking food and ceremonial sage mixed with the acrid smoke that continued to drift down from the advancing wildfire. "Hello," she called out in English, pitching her voice to carry over the drumming without being aggressive. "I'm fleeing the fire. I need help." The drumming stopped abruptly. Silence stretched across the clearing, broken only by the crackling of campfires and the distant roar of the approaching flames. Annabelle could sense movement around her, people repositioning themselves, whispered conversations in the Mandan language, the soft sounds of what might have been weapons being readied. A voice answered her from somewhere directly ahead, speaking accented but clear English. "You walk with the fire spirits, blind woman. The flames follow where you go." The speaker was male, probably middle-aged, based on the depth and quality of his voice. More importantly, he'd immediately identified her blindness, something that wasn't necessarily obvious to strangers, especially in firelight. "The fire follows all of us," Annabelle replied. "It's a wildfire, not spirits. It's going to reach this clearing soon, and we all need to move to safer ground." More whispered conversation in Mandan, followed by what sounded like an argument between several voices. The fire's glow was definitely getting brighter behind her, and she could feel the temperature continuing to rise. "You sing to the wolves," the same voice said. "We heard your songs in the canyon. The Pack brothers listened to your music instead of hunting you." This gave Annabelle pause. If they'd been close enough to hear her singing in the canyon, they'd been watching her approach for some time. They'd let her find them rather than revealing themselves earlier. "The wolves were fleeing the fire. Same as me," she said. "There was no point in fighting when we all wanted the same thing, to escape." A different voice spoke up, this one belonging to a woman. "She speaks wisdom about the fire that devours all. The flames care nothing for ceremony or sacred ground. They will burn this place as surely as they burn the forest." The man who had first spoken seemed to consider this. Annabelle could hear him moving closer, his footsteps confident on ground he knew well. When he spoke again, he was perhaps 10 feet away from her. "I am Joseph Crowdog, scout for the Mandan people, keeper of the old ways. You have interrupted our ceremony of remembrance, blind woman. Tell me why the spirits have sent you to us with fire at your heels." "My name is Annabelle Morrison, and I'm not sent by anyone," she replied. "I lived in a cabin about 12 miles upstream. The fire reached my home this morning, and I've been following the creek trying to escape. I didn't know there was anyone else out here." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, and she could sense him studying her in the firelight. Other members of his group had moved closer as well. She could hear their breathing and the soft rustle of clothing as they positioned themselves around her. "The spirits work in ways we do not always understand," he said finally. "You arrive at the moment we honor those who passed in the Great Fire of 1837, when disease and flame took so many of our people. Perhaps this is not a coincidence." The woman's voice spoke again, closer now and tinged with urgency. "Joseph, the flame wall approaches faster than a running horse. We can honor the dead properly when we ourselves are not about to join them." As if summoned by her words, a new sound reached them from the forest behind Annabel. The explosive crack of large trees falling, followed by a whooshing roar that spoke of flames leaping from crown to crown through the forest canopy. The fire had found the valley floor and was accelerating through the dry grassland. "Sarah Knife speaks truth," Joseph said, and Annabel could hear him moving quickly now. "Break the circle. Pack only what cannot be replaced. We move to the river crossing." The encampment erupted into controlled activity. People scattered to collapse what must have been elaborate ceremonial arrangements, while others focused on gathering essential supplies. Annabel could hear horses stomping and snorting as they sensed the approaching danger and the clatter of equipment being loaded quickly onto pack animals. "Can you ride?" Joseph asked her, suddenly appearing at her. "Ilbo, I haven't been on a horse in 15 years, Annabel admitted, "but I can try if it's that or burn." "It is exactly that or burn," Sarah's voice confirmed from nearby. "The fire moves faster than any person can run, but horses can outpace it if we leave now." Strong hands guided Annabel toward one of the horses, a mare that seemed calmer than the others despite the chaos around them. Joseph helped her mount, then swung up behind her, taking the reins. "This is Moonwalker," he said as the horse began moving. "She has carried me through 3 seasons of firefighting. She knows to run from flames." The group moved out of the clearing in what felt like organized retreat rather than panicked flight. Annabel could hear perhaps a dozen horses, some carrying double riders, others loaded with supplies. They moved quickly but not recklessly, following what was clearly a predetermined escape route. "The river crossing Joseph mentioned," Annabel said as they rode. "How far?" 2 miles through the country Moonwalker knows well," he replied. "But the fire will reach the clearing we just left in perhaps 20 minutes. We are in a race now." Behind them, the night sky was growing brighter with each passing minute. The fire had found substantial fuel in the valley grasslands and was consuming everything with terrifying efficiency. Annabel could feel the heat on her back growing stronger, and the smoke was getting thick enough to make the horses nervous. Moonwalker was indeed well trained for this kind of emergency. She moved with sure footing even in the darkness, following trails Annabel couldn't detect, but which were clearly familiar to the experienced mare. Joseph rode with the confidence of someone who had made this journey before, probably multiple times. "You said this was a ceremony of remembrance," Annabel said as they crested what felt like a small hill. "Were you remembering people who died in a fire?" "The year of the Great Dying," Joseph confirmed. 1837. Smallpox brought by traders, followed by drought and wildfire. My people lost 3/4 of our number that year. We gather each summer to honor their memory and ensure their names are not forgotten. The weight of that tragedy settled over Annabel as they rode. An entire culture nearly destroyed in a single year, and here were the survivors still honoring their dead more than a century and a half later. "I'm sorry I interrupted," she said. "That kind of remembrance is important." "Perhaps you did not interrupt," Joseph replied thoughtfully. "Perhaps you were meant to be part of it. The ancestors sometimes speak through unexpected messengers." A shout from one of the other riders interrupted their conversation. The words were in Mandan, but the tone conveyed urgency. Joseph called back, then urged Moonwalker to move faster. "What's wrong?" Annabel asked. "Samuel Bear in water scouts ahead. He says the usual ford is too deep from recent rains. We must try the rocky crossing upstream." This was clearly not good news based on the tension she could feel in Joseph's posture. The horse beneath them was beginning to work harder too, breathing more heavily as they climbed what felt like steeper terrain. The sound of running water reached them, not the gentle babbling of the creek she'd been following, but the substantial flow of a real river. As they drew closer, Annabel could hear the difference between deep water moving slowly and shallower water rushing over rocks. The rocky crossing, Joseph explained as they approached. More dangerous, especially in darkness, but possible if the horses are careful. They reached the riverbank, and Annabel could immediately sense why this crossing was considered risky. The water was moving fast, and she could hear it rushing around and over obstacles that created a complex pattern of currents and eddies. In daylight, with time to study the route, it might be manageable. In darkness, with fire approaching behind them, it would be treacherous. The other riders had gathered at the water's edge, and she could hear heated discussion in Mandan. Joseph dismounted and moved away from Moonwalker, leaving Annabel alone on the horse, while he consulted with the others. When he returned, his voice carried grim determination. Samuel will lead his horse across first, testing the footing. If he makes it safely, the rest will follow one at a time. You and I will go last. Moonwalker is the most experienced with difficult crossings. And if Samuel doesn't make it safely, Annabel asked. Joseph was quiet for a moment. Then we try to outrun the fire on this side of the river. The first horse entered the water, with Samuel calling encouragement in Mandan. Annabel could track his progress by the sounds, the splash of hooves against water, the scramble of iron shoes against wet rock, the occasional snort from his mount. As she worked through the challenging footing, it seemed to take forever. But finally Samuel's voice called back from the far side, triumphant and relieved. One by one, the other riders followed. Each crossing was an exercise in controlled terror. Horses slipping on wet rocks, riders calling out warnings about hidden obstacles, the constant sound of fast water that could sweep away anyone who lost their footing. 2 horses went down during the crossings, dumping their riders into the swift current. Both times, the people managed to grab onto their mounts and were pulled to safety on the far bank, but essential supplies were lost to the river. When their turn came, Joseph remounted behind Annabel and guided Moonwalker to the water's edge. Behind them, the fire had reached the hill they'd climbed earlier. Trees were exploding into flame with sounds like gunshots, and the heat was becoming unbearable. "Hold tight," Joseph said. "Moonwalker knows what to do, but the river is angry." Tonight, the mare stepped carefully into the rushing water, testing each footstep before committing her weight. The current immediately grabbed at her legs, and Annabel could feel the horse working hard to maintain balance against the force of the flow. Halfway across, Moonwalker's rear hoof slipped on a moss-covered rock. The horse stumbled, and for a terrifying moment Annabel thought they were going into the river, but the experienced mare recovered, finding new footing and pushing forward with the determination of an animal that understood the stakes. They reached the far bank just as the fire crested the hill behind them. The entire valley was now a wall of flame stretching as far as Annabel could see through her limited vision. If they had delayed their crossing by even another few minutes, the heat would have made it impossible. "Safe," Joseph breathed as Moonwalker climbed up onto dry ground. "All of us safe." But Annabel could hear in his voice that their ordeal was far from over. They had escaped the immediate threat of the wildfire, but they were now on the wrong side of a dangerous river, miles from any settlement, with limited supplies and no way to return home until the fire burned itself out. The ceremony, Joseph's. People had been conducting. The remembrance of those lost to fire and disease in 1837 had become a stark reminder that survival in this harsh country was never guaranteed. They had escaped death tonight, but the real test of their endurance was just beginning. As the group gathered on the riverbank to assess their situation, Annabel realized that her journey was transforming from a desperate escape into something much more complex. She had fled her burning cabin as a refugee seeking safety. Now she found herself part of a community, facing an uncertain future together. The fire continued to rage across the valley behind them, But on this side of the river, under stars barely visible through the smoke, a different story was beginning. Dawn came with an eerie orange glow, filtering through smoke so thick it seemed solid. Annabel woke to the sound of horses moving restlessly and voices speaking in urgent, hushed tones. The ground beneath her bedroll was damp with dew, but the air itself felt dry and brittle, charged with the electricity of a landscape under siege. She had slept perhaps 3 hours, curled against a fallen log, while Joseph and the others took turns keeping watch through the night. Every time she'd started to drift into deeper sleep, the sound of exploding trees from across the river had jolted her awake. The fire was still raging through the valley they'd escaped, consuming everything in its path with relentless hunger. "The wind has changed," Sarah Knife said from somewhere nearby. Her voice carried a weight of concern that made Annabel sit up immediately. "It brings the fire toward the river." Annabel could feel the shift Sarah was talking about. Instead of the steady breeze that had been carrying smoke away from their position during the night, the air now moved in unpredictable gusts that brought waves of heat and ash directly toward them. The relative safety of their riverside camp was disappearing with each passing hour. Joseph's voice cut through the morning conversations. "Break camp. We move to higher ground while we still can." "Where?" asked a younger man whose voice Annabel didn't recognize. "The fire has cut us off from the trading post. The river is too dangerous to cross back. We're trapped between water and flame." "Not trapped," Joseph replied firmly. "Guided. The spirits have brought us to this place for a reason. We follow the old trail to Medicine Rocks." This announcement sparked immediate discussion among the group. Annabel could hear fragments of conversation in both English and Mandan, and the tone suggested this wasn't a decision everyone agreed with. Medicine Rocks apparently represented either salvation or foolishness, depending on who was speaking. Sarah appeared beside Annabel's bedroll, her approach so quiet that Annabel only noticed her when she spoke. "Can you walk long distances on rough ground?" she asked. "The trail Joseph speaks of is not meant for horses carrying riders. We will lead them, not ride them." "How long?" Annabel asked, rolling up her blanket and preparing to move. 2 days, if we are fortunate. 3 if the path has been damaged by recent storms." Sarah paused. "It is a sacred trail, used by our people for generations, when the world becomes too dangerous for ordinary routes." Joseph had moved closer during their conversation. "Medicine Rocks is a place of power," he explained. "Natural caves in stone cliffs with springs that never run dry. If we can reach it, we can wait there until the fire burns itself out." "And if we can't reach it?" Annabel asked. The silence that followed her question was answered enough. The group began moving within the hour, leading their horses along what felt like an animal trail that paralleled the river. Annabel walked between Sarah and Joseph, using their guidance to navigate terrain that was rougher than anything she'd encountered during her flight from the cabin. The path climbed steadily away from the water, winding through stands of aspen that had somehow escaped the fire's advance. But the reprieve was temporary. She could smell smoke growing stronger with each mile they traveled, and the heat was building despite the early morning hour. "Tell me about the ceremony," I interrupted, Annabel said as they walked. Conversation helped distract her from the growing burn in her legs and the worry about what lay ahead. "Each summer, we gather to speak the names of those who died in the year of great sickness," Joseph replied. 1837 was when the white man's diseases reached our villages. Smallpox mainly, but also measles and whooping cough. We had no resistance to such illnesses. Sarah picked up the story. "My great-grandmother was one of the few children who survived. She watched her parents, her brothers, her grandparents all die within weeks of each other. The traditional ways of caring for the sick proved useless against diseases our people had never faced." After the sickness came the drought, Joseph continued. Then prairie fires that burned for months. The buffalo herds scattered or died. Rivers ran dry. It was as if the world itself was trying to end. The weight of that history settled over their small group as they climbed higher into the hills. Annabel realized she was walking with people whose ancestors had survived one of the greatest catastrophes in North American history, the near-complete destruction of their civilization within a single generation. "How many survived?" she asked. "Of the Mandan people?" "Perhaps 200 from a population of thousands," Sarah said quietly. "We are the children of those survivors. Every name we speak in ceremony represents not just one person, but entire family lines that ended forever." The trail they followed began to show signs of regular use, packed earth worn smooth by countless feet over many years. But it also showed recent damage from storms and erosion that made footing treacherous. In places, around midday, they encountered their first major obstacle. A section of the hillside had given way during recent heavy rains, creating a slide zone of loose rock and mud that stretched across their path. The horses would need to be led carefully around the unstable area, adding hours to their journey. While Joseph and 2 other men worked out a safe route for the animals, Annabel found herself sitting on a flat rock beside Samuel Bear in water, the scout who had tested the river crossing the night before. "You handle the trail well for someone who cannot see it," he observed. "Most city people would have fallen a dozen times by now." "I'm not exactly city people," Annabel replied. "I've been living alone in the mountains for 3 years. You learn to trust your feet when your eyes don't work." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Why alone? Most people need other people to feel safe. It was a question Annabel had been asked many times, and she developed several different answers depending on who was asking and why. But something about Samuel's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "I wanted to prove I could take care of myself," she said. "After I lost my sight, everyone treated me like I was helpless. Family, friends, even strangers on the street. They all acted like blindness made me incompetent. I got tired of being managed and protected and spoken for." "And did you prove it? That you could take care of yourself?" Annabel gestured toward the smoke-filled sky and the dangerous trail ahead. "Ask me again when we reach these medicine rocks." Samuel laughed, a sound of genuine appreciation. "A fair answer. The mountains test everyone equally, sighted or blind." The group resumed traveling once they'd safely navigated around the landslide. The afternoon grew progressively more oppressive as smoke thickened and the wind continued to push heat and ash in their direction. Several times they had to stop and cover their faces with wet cloth as particularly dense clouds of smoke rolled over them. The horses were showing signs of stress now, constantly snorting and shaking their heads to clear smoke from their nostrils. 2 of the animals developed persistent coughs that spoke of lung irritation from the poor air quality. "How much farther to these caves?" Annabel asked during one of their rest stops. "We should reach the base of the cliff before sunset," Joseph replied, "but the climb to the caves will have to wait for morning. That part of the trail is too dangerous to attempt in darkness." This was troubling news. Spending another night in the open, with the fire growing closer and the air quality deteriorating, would put additional strain on both people and animals. But attempting a difficult climb in the dark would be even more dangerous. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to change dramatically. The gentle hills and scattered trees gave way to more rugged terrain, dominated by towering rock formations that rose like ancient monuments from the surrounding forest. The trail became steeper and more challenging, winding between massive boulders and along narrow ledges that offered spectacular views of the valley below. Even through her limited vision, Annabel could see that the entire valley was now consumed by fire. What had started as a forest fire had grown into something that resembled a natural disaster of biblical proportions. Smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the air, and the heat radiating from the burning landscape was creating its own weather. Patterns. "I've never seen anything like this," Sarah said, stopping to stare at the destruction below. "The fire of 1988 was terrible, but this burns hotter and faster than anything in our stories." Joseph joined them at the overlook. "Climate change," he said simply. "The white man's industry has heated the world, dried the forests, made the fire season longer and more dangerous. Our ancestors dealt with natural fires that cleared undergrowth and renewed the forest. This is something else entirely." The group pressed on as shadows began to lengthen, driven by the knowledge that every hour brought the fire closer to their position. The rock formations grew larger and more imposing as they climbed, until they were walking through a landscape that felt more like cathedral architecture than natural terrain. Just as the last light was fading from the smoke-darkened sky, they reached the base of a cliff that rose so high Annabelle couldn't see its top, even as a shadow against the stars. The rock face was split by what felt like a natural staircase, a series of ledges and crevices that formed a rough path upward toward unseen caves. "Medicine rocks," Joseph announced. "Tomorrow we climb to safety." The group made camp in a sheltered area at the base of the cliff, using the rock wall to block the worst of the wind-driven smoke and ash. But even here, protected by stone and distance, the fire's presence was inescapable. The air tasted of burning pine and sage, and the constant background roar of flames consuming the valley below never ceased. Annabelle lay on her bedroll, listening to the conversations around her as the group settled in for what they all hoped would be their last night in the open. The talk was subdued, focused on practical concerns about the climb ahead and speculation about how long they might need to remain in the caves. But underneath the practical discussions, she could hear something else. A quiet recognition that this experience was changing all of them. The ceremony they'd been conducting when she'd stumbled into their camp had been about remembering the dead from a historical catastrophe. Now they were living through their own catastrophe, one that would become part of the stories told to future generations. "Annabelle," Joseph's voice called softly from across the small camp, "come sit with Sarah and me. There are things you should know about tomorrow's climb." She made her way carefully to where they sat near one of the small fires the group had built. "Using deadfall wood, the path up the cliff is ancient," Sarah began, "made by our people hundreds of years ago, before the white settlers came. It follows natural cracks and ledges in the rock, but some sections require climbing skills." "I can't see the handholds," Annabelle pointed out. "Which is why you will climb rope to me," Joseph said. "I will guide your hands to each hold, and you will climb when I tell you it is safe to move." This sounded terrifying, but Annabelle realized she had no choice. The fire below was still advancing, and staying at the base of the cliff would mean certain death within hours. "Have you ever guided a blind person up a cliff before?" she asked. Joseph was quiet for a moment. "No," he admitted, "but I have climbed that cliff in complete darkness during vision quests. Sometimes the eyes see less truly than the hands and heart." As the night deepened and the conversations around the camp gradually died away, Annabelle found herself staring up at the invisible cliff face above them. Somewhere up there, in caves carved by wind and water over countless centuries, lay safety. But between here and there stretched what might be the most dangerous few hours of her life. The fire continued to rage in the valley below, and the smoke continued to thicken around their camp. By morning they would either be safe in the medicine rock's caves, or they would be dead. There was no middle ground left. The rope around Annabelle's waist felt both reassuring and terrifying as Joseph checked the knots one final time. Dawn had brought no relief from the smoke and heat. If anything, the air quality had deteriorated further overnight as the fire found new fuel sources and wind patterns shifted to drive the worst of the pollution directly toward the cliff. "A base. Remember," Joseph said, his voice steady despite the circumstances, "trust your hands more than your fear. The rock will tell you where to go if you listen to what you feel rather than what you imagine." Annabelle nodded, though her stomach was churning with anxiety about the climb ahead. Around them, the rest of the group was making final preparations for the ascent. The horses would have to be left behind. There was no way to get them up the cliff face, and trying would only result in dead animals and potentially dead people. Sarah had already started up the cliff with Samuel Bear in water, testing the route and clearing loose stones that might fall on the climbers below. Their voices echoed strangely off the rock face as they called down information about the condition of various holds and ledges. "The first section is not too difficult," Joseph explained as he led Annabelle to the base of the cliff. "Perhaps 30 feet of climbing, but the holds are good and the angle is not too steep. After that, we rest on a ledge before attempting the more challenging sections above." Annabelle reached out to touch the rock face, running her fingers over stone that had been shaped by countless seasons of freeze and thaw, wind and rain. The surface was rougher than she'd expected, offering plenty of texture for gripping, but it was warm to the touch from the heat, radiating up from the fire-consumed valley below. "I'm ready," she said, though she felt anything but ready. Joseph began climbing, moving slowly, and calling down detailed instructions for each move. "Put your right hand where mine was. Yes, there. Feel that little depression? Your fingers fit perfectly. Now your left foot goes on the small ledge about 2 feet up and to your left." The first few moves were awkward, as Annabelle learned to coordinate her movements with Joseph's guidance, but gradually she began to develop a rhythm. The rope between them provided both safety and communication. She could feel the tension when Joseph was moving, when he had stopped to assess the route ahead, when he was preparing for a more difficult section. Her world narrowed to the immediate sensations of rock against her palms, the burn in her forearms as she pulled herself upward. The careful placement of each foot on holds that were sometimes solid and sometimes crumbly with age. The sounds of the fire below became distant background noise as all her attention focused on the next handhold, the next step upward. "Rest here," Joseph called down after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes of climbing. "There is a good ledge." Annabelle hauled herself up onto a narrow shelf of rock that was just wide enough for her to sit comfortably. Her legs trembled with fatigue, and her hands were already developing blisters from gripping the rough stone. Looking down, since her limited vision could make out the contrast between the cliff face and the smoky air below, she was amazed at how much height they'd already gained. Joseph sat beside her on the ledge, breathing heavily but not showing the exhaustion Annabelle felt in every muscle. "How do you feel?" "Terrified but alive," she replied honestly. "How much more climbing?" "The hardest section is next," he admitted. "About 50 feet that requires more technical skill. After that, the path becomes easier as it follows natural terraces toward the caves." Above them, Sarah's voice called down from much higher up the cliff. Her words were indistinct, but the tone suggested she had successfully navigated whatever challenges lay ahead. Other members of their group were at various points on the cliff face below them. Annabelle could hear the scrape of boots against stone, and occasional muttered curses as someone struggled with a particularly difficult move. Everyone was climbing rope to a partner, creating a network of safety lines that connected the entire group. "The section above us requires what rock climbers call chimney technique," Joseph explained. "The cliff splits into a narrow crack that we climb by, bracing our backs against one wall and our feet against the other, then walking upward, using opposing pressure." This sounded even more terrifying than regular climbing, but Annabelle nodded her understanding. The heat from below was getting worse by the hour, and staying where they were was not an option. Joseph led the way into the crack, which was barely wide enough for their bodies. The technique he described was awkward and exhausting. Annabel had to lean back against one wall of stone while pressing her feet against the opposite wall, then inch upward, using her leg muscles to maintain pressure while her back slid up the rough rock surface. "Don't think about falling," Joseph advised from above her. "The crack is narrow enough that you couldn't fall far, even if you wanted to. Focus on steady pressure and small movements upward." The chimney section seemed to go on forever. Annabel's back was being scraped raw against the stone, and her legs burned with the constant effort of maintaining pressure against the opposite wall. Twice she had to stop and rest, wedging herself in place while she caught her breath and let her muscles recover. But gradually the crack began to widen, and finally Joseph called down that he was emerging onto another ledge system. With a final push that left her gasping with effort, Annabel hauled herself out of the chimney and onto blessed horizontal ground. This ledge was much larger than the first, wide enough for several people to rest comfortably. Sarah was already there, along with two other members of their group who had completed the climb ahead of them. Everyone looked exhausted, but relieved to be past the most technical section. "The caves are just above us now," Sarah said, pointing toward what looked like dark openings in the cliff face about 50 feet higher. "The path from here is more like hiking than climbing." As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, a new sound reached them from the valley below. The roar of the fire had changed pitch, becoming deeper and more continuous. When Annabel looked down, she could see that flames had reached the base of the cliff and were beginning to work their way up the lower slopes, consuming the scattered vegetation that clung to the rocky terrain. "We need to move," Joseph said grimly. "The fire is climbing toward us." The final section of the ascent was indeed more like hiking, following a natural path that zigzagged up the cliff face through a series of natural terraces and gentle slopes. But it was still treacherous footing, especially with smoke making visibility poor and everyone exhausted from the technical climbing below. One by one, the members of their group reached the caves. Annabel was among the last to arrive, her legs shaking with fatigue and her hands raw from gripping stone for hours. But when she finally stepped into the cool darkness of the cave entrance, she felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. The caves were larger than she had expected. The entrance opened into a substantial chamber with smooth walls that suggested centuries of use by people seeking shelter. The air was cooler here and notably cleaner, filtered by the stone passages that led deeper into the cliff. "Sacred water," Sarah announced from somewhere deeper in the cave system. "The spring still flows clear and cold." The sound of running water was indeed audible from the cave's interior, a gentle babbling that spoke of reliable water sources even in the driest seasons. For people who had been breathing smoke and ash for 2 days, the promise of clean water was almost overwhelming. Joseph helped Annabel settle on a smooth section of cave floor, then went to check on the other members of their group. Everyone had made it safely to the caves, though several people were nursing cuts and scrapes from the difficult climb. "How long do we stay here?" asked one of the younger men, whose name Annabel had learned was David Corn Planter. "Until the fire burns itself out," Joseph replied. "Could be days, could be weeks. These caves have sheltered our people through worse disasters than this one." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of the fire below grew noticeably louder. Flames had apparently reached the base of the cliff and were now consuming whatever. Vegetation grew in the cracks and crevices of the lower rock face. The heat was even affecting the cave temperature, though they were hundreds of feet above the valley floor. Sarah returned from exploring the cave system with news about their temporary home. Three main chambers connected by passages. The spring feeds a small pool in the deepest chamber. Water is clean and cold. There are signs that people have lived here before. Fire rings, storage areas, even some pictographs on the walls. Our ancestors used this place during the troubles of 1837, Joseph explained to Annabel. When the sickness came and the buffalo disappeared, some families retreated to caves like this and waited for the world to heal itself. They left signs and symbols to guide future generations who might need the same refuge. The implications of this sank in slowly. Annabel realized she was not just sheltering in a cave, but occupying a space that had served as a lifeboat for Joseph's people during their own historical catastrophe. The ceremony they had been conducting when she stumbled into their camp, the remembrance of those who died in 1837, had taken on new meaning now that they were literally following in their ancestors' footsteps. "What kind of signs?" she asked. Sarah's voice came from near one of the cave walls. Symbols showing safe passages deeper into the cliff. Marks indicating where to find water, where to build fires so the smoke escapes properly. Instructions for storing food and waste so the cave remains healthy for long-term occupation. They were preparing for survival, Joseph added. Not just hiding until danger passed, but creating a temporary community that could sustain itself, indefinitely if necessary. As the group settled into the cave system and began the process of organizing their limited supplies, Annabel found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this place. 3 days ago, she had been living alone in a cabin, proud of her independence and self-sufficiency. Now she was part of a community facing an uncertain future together, dependent on each other for survival in ways she had never experienced. The fire continued to rage below them, but here in the caves, surrounded by people who had welcomed her as one of their own, Annabel felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt like she belonged somewhere. Outside, the world was burning, but inside Medicine Rocks, in caves that had sheltered survivors for generations, a different story was unfolding. It was a story about the strength that comes from community, about the wisdom of ancestors who had faced impossible odds and endured, and about the unexpected ways that catastrophe can bring people together rather than drive them apart. The flames would eventually burn themselves out. The smoke would clear. The valley below would begin the slow process of regeneration that follows every great fire. But the bonds forged in these caves, between people thrown together by disaster and united by their determination to survive, would outlast the emergency that had created them. Annabel closed her eyes and listened to the quiet conversations around her, to the sound of clean water flowing somewhere in the darkness, to the distant roar of fire that no longer seemed like a threat. For the first time since she had lost her sight 12 years ago, she felt truly safe. 3 weeks in the caves had transformed their group from desperate refugees into something resembling a functioning community. Annabel woke on what she estimated was their 22nd morning in Medicine Rocks to the familiar sounds of people going about established routines. Water being collected from the spring, quiet conversations about the day's tasks, and the soft scraping of tools against stone as David Cornplanter continued his work expanding their food storage areas. The fire below had finally burned itself out 5 days ago, leaving behind a landscape that Sarah described as moon-like in its desolation. But the air was clear now, and from the cave entrance they could see the first signs of regeneration beginning in the valley. Tiny green shoots pushing up through the ash, early wildflowers taking advantage of the cleared ground and increased sunlight. The world heals itself, Joseph had observed yesterday as they watched a family of deer pick their way carefully across the burned valley floor. Fire destroys, but it also creates conditions for new life. Annabel had learned more about survival in these 3 weeks than in her previous 3 years of solitary mountain living. The cave community had developed systems for everything: water collection and purification, food preparation and storage, waste management, even entertainment during the long hours when there was nothing to do but wait for the outside world to become habitable again. She had discovered skills she didn't know she possessed. Her heightened sense of touch made her particularly good at working with the native plants Samuel brought back from his daily foraging expeditions. She could identify edible roots and berries by texture and smell with an accuracy that impressed even Sarah, who had been trained in traditional plant knowledge since childhood. More importantly, she had learned what it meant to be part of a community, where everyone contributed according to their abilities rather than being judged by their limitations. "Annabelle," Joseph's voice called from the cave entrance, "come see this." She made her way carefully through the cave system, following paths she now knew by heart. The group had created a network of rope guides between the chambers, making navigation easier for everyone, but especially helpful for her in the complete darkness of the deeper passages. Joseph was standing at the main entrance, silhouetted against morning light that seemed brighter and clearer than any they had seen since arriving at Medicine Rocks. When she joined him, she could immediately sense what had caught his attention. Sound. Not the oppressive silence that had characterized the burned valley for weeks, but the actual sounds of life returning. Birds calling from somewhere below, the rustle of small animals moving through vegetation, even the distant lowing of cattle that suggested human activity was resuming in areas that had escaped the fire. "The ranchers from the East Valley," Sarah said, appearing beside them. "Their herds survived because they moved them early when they saw the smoke. Now they're bringing them back to graze the new grass that's coming up through the ash." This was significant news. If cattle were being moved back into the area, it meant the danger was truly past and normal human activity could resume. After 3 weeks of isolation, the prospect of rejoining the outside world was both exciting and daunting. "How long before we can safely travel?" Annabelle asked. Joseph considered this carefully before answering. "The valleys are safe now. The fire burned so completely there's no fuel left to reignite. But the trails will be different. Landmarks destroyed, creek beds changed by mudslides after the rains we had last week. It will take time to learn the new landscape." Over the past week, Samuel had been making increasingly long scouting expeditions from the caves, mapping the changes to the terrain below and identifying safe routes through areas that had been completely transformed by the fire. His reports painted a picture of a landscape that was recognizable in its basic geography, but altered in almost every detail. "Your cabin?" Sarah asked gently. It was a question that had hung unspoken between them for days. "Gone," Samuel reported matter-of-factly. "The fire burned so hot in that area that even the stone foundation cracked. But the creek still runs clear, and the soil beneath the ash is already showing signs of recovery." Annabelle had been expecting this news for weeks, but hearing it confirmed still brought a sharp pang of loss. 3 years of carefully constructed independence reduced to ash and memories. Everything she had built to prove her competence and self-sufficiency erased in a few hours of flame, but the grief was different than she had expected. Less devastating, more like the closing of one chapter before beginning another. The woman who had fled that burning cabin 3 weeks ago was not the same person who stood at the cave entrance now. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about what comes next." Joseph and Sarah waited for her to continue, a patience she had come to appreciate during their time in the caves. No one rushed conversations here. No one filled comfortable silences with unnecessary words. "I don't want to go back to living alone," she said finally. "These weeks have shown me something I didn't know I was missing." "Community," Sarah said, understanding immediately. "Purpose beyond just survival," Annabelle agreed. "A place where what I can do matters more than what I can't do." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the recovering valley below. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. "The old ways of our people recognized different kinds of medicine," he said. "Plant medicine, ceremony medicine, story medicine. But also the medicine that comes from people whose other senses are stronger because one sense is absent. Healers who could diagnose illness by touch, storytellers who remembered songs perfectly because they couldn't rely on written words." "What are you saying?" Annabelle asked. "I'm saying that if you want to stay with us, there are ways to make that happen. The reservation has programs for traditional skills preservation. Your plant knowledge, your ability to work by touch and smell, these are valuable abilities that could benefit many people." Sarah picked up the thread of his suggestion. "The tribal college has been looking for someone to help develop tactile learning programs for traditional crafts. Beadwork, weaving, food preparation. Skills that are often taught through demonstration, but could be adapted for people who learn better through touch." The possibility they were describing felt almost too good to be true. A chance to use her hard-won adaptive skills to help others, while being part of a community that valued her contributions rather than seeing her as someone to be managed or protected. "There would be paperwork," Joseph admitted. "Immigration to the reservation, establishing residency, formal enrollment in the programs. But it can be done if you're serious about wanting to try." "I'm serious," Annabelle replied without hesitation. "More serious than I've been about anything in years." The conversation was interrupted by voices calling from below the cliff. Samuel's voice answered from somewhere near the cave entrance, and soon he was leading two strangers up the final section of path that approached Medicine Rocks. The newcomers were officials from the County Emergency Management Office, conducting welfare checks on people who had been reported missing during the fire. They had tracked the group to the caves using reports from the ranchers who had spotted smoke from their campfires. "Everyone accounted for and in good health," the lead official reported into his radio after conducting a quick head count. "No medical emergencies, no immediate assistance required, but the arrival of outside authorities marked the end of their isolation period. Within hours, family members and friends began arriving to collect people who had been assumed lost in the fire. The close-knit community that had developed in the caves began to disperse as people returned to their normal lives. By evening, only Annabelle, Joseph, Sarah, and Samuel remained at Medicine Rocks. Everyone else had departed with promises to stay, in touch and invitations to future gatherings. But Annabelle knew that the intense bonds forged in crisis would inevitably weaken as people resumed their regular routines. "Endings are also beginnings," Joseph observed as they sat around a small fire at the cave entrance, watching the sun set over the scarred but recovering valley. "The ceremony we were conducting when you found us, it was about honoring the past while preparing for the future." "What future?" Annabelle asked. Sarah answered by pulling something from her pack, a bundle wrapped in soft leather that she handled with obvious reverence. When she opened it, Annabelle could see that it contained what looked like beadwork, intricate patterns worked in tiny glass beads that caught the firelight. "This was made by my great-grandmother, one of the survivors of 1837, Sarah explained. "She made it during the years after the Great Dying, when our people were learning to rebuild their lives from almost nothing." She placed the beadwork in Annabelle's hands, guiding her fingers over the complex patterns. "Feel the pattern," she instructed. Each bead placed by touch, guided by memory of designs that existed only in her mind after all the written records were lost. Annabelle ran her fingers over the intricate work, feeling the subtle variations in bead size and the precise regularity of the stitching. It was remarkable craftsmanship, but more than that, it was a tangible connection to a person who had faced impossible circumstances and found ways to preserve beauty and meaning through the darkest times. She taught these patterns to her children, who taught them to their children, Sarah continued. But the knowledge is fragile. Each generation, we lose a little more as people move away from traditional ways. Until now, Joseph added meaningfully. Your arrival during our ceremony, your survival skills, your ability to work by touch, these aren't coincidences. The ancestors sent you to us for a reason. What reason? Annabel asked, though she was beginning to understand. To help us preserve what might otherwise be lost, Sarah said. To learn the old ways of making beautiful things by touch and memory, and to teach others who might benefit from these skills. The beadwork in Annabel's hands seemed to pulse with significance as she realized what they were offering her. Not just a place in their community, but a role in preserving cultural knowledge that connected the present to generations of survivors who had refused to let catastrophe define their future. When do we start? She asked. Joseph smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she had seen from him since they'd met in the chaos of the fire. We already have, he said. The moment you chose to stay with us, instead of trying to escape alone, you became part of the story we're telling. Above them, stars were becoming visible through the clear air for the first time in weeks. The fire that had brought them together was now just a memory preserved in ash and scorched stone. But the connections forged in crisis, the skills learned under pressure, and the community created from necessity had become something permanent and valuable. Annabel looked out over the valley that would soon be green again, holding beadwork created by hands that had never seen it, surrounded by people who valued her abilities rather than pitying her limitations. The cabin she had lost to the fire seemed like part of someone else's life now. Tomorrow they would begin the journey down from Medicine Rocks, leaving the caves that had sheltered them during the crisis. But they would not be returning to the lives they had left behind. They were carrying forward something new, a community strengthened by shared survival, traditional knowledge preserved through modern adaptation, and the understanding that the strongest medicine often comes from the most unexpected sources. The fire had taken everything Annabel thought she needed. In return, it had given her everything she hadn't known she was missing. 6 months after descending from Medicine Rocks, Annabel sat in the cultural center of the 3 affiliated tribes' reservation, her fingers moving with practiced precision through a complex star pattern that would have challenged even experienced beadworkers. Around her, a circle of students, some sighted, some visually impaired, some learning disabled, worked through their own versions of traditional designs under her guidance. Don't rely on your eyes to tell you if the pattern is correct, she instructed a teenage girl who was struggling with a geometric design. Feel the rhythm of the beadwork. Each pattern has its own heartbeat that you can sense through your fingertips. The girl, Maria Spotted Horse, had been born with partial vision that was steadily deteriorating due to a genetic condition. Learning traditional crafts through touch rather than sight was giving her confidence that she would still be able to create beautiful things even as her vision continued to fail. Like this? Maria asked, adjusting the tension on her thread. Annabel reached over to examine the work, her fingers tracing the emerging pattern. Better. Feel how the beads want to lie against each other. They'll guide you to the right placement if you listen to what they're telling you. The teaching program Joseph and Sarah had envisioned had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What had started as a simple proposal to preserve traditional beadwork techniques had expanded into a comprehensive curriculum that combined cultural education with adaptive skill development. Students came from across the region to learn methods that worked for people with various disabilities and learning differences. But Annabel's integration into reservation life hadn't been without challenges. The bureaucratic process of establishing residency and work authorization had taken months of paperwork and legal consultations. Some community members had initially questioned whether an outsider should be teaching traditional skills, regardless of her abilities or good intentions. Those doubts had largely faded as the results of her work became apparent. The program she developed wasn't replacing traditional teaching methods. It was expanding them to include people who had previously been excluded from cultural preservation efforts. "Tell us the story again," called out James White Bull, a veteran who had lost his sight to an IED explosion in Afghanistan. He was working on a pair of moccasins, decorating them with beadwork that would have been impossible for him to create. Using conventional methods, Annabelle smiled. The students never tired of hearing about her escape from the fire, though the version she told in class focused more on the survival skills and less on the life-threatening drama. "Which part of the story?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "The wolves," several voices said simultaneously. "Ah, the wolves." Annabelle set down her own beadwork and leaned back in her chair. "The most important thing to understand about that encounter is that fear makes enemies where none need to exist." She had told this story dozens of times now, but each telling revealed new layers of meaning as she gained distance from the events and deeper understanding of their significance. The wolves were refugees from the fire just like me. They were scared, displaced, looking for safety in unfamiliar territory. My first instinct was to see them as predators, as threats to be avoided or fought. Maria looked up from her beadwork. "But you sang to them instead." "I sang to them because I realized we were all in the same situation. Fighting would have wasted energy we all needed for escape, and it might have gotten someone hurt unnecessarily. Singing was a way to communicate that I wasn't a threat, that we could share the same space without conflict." James nodded approvingly. "Same principle as dealing with hostile locals overseas. Sometimes the best weapon is showing you don't want to fight." These conversations had become a regular part of the classes. The students found parallels between Annabelle's survival story and their own experiences of adapting to disabilities, overcoming challenges, and learning to navigate a world that wasn't always designed for their needs. "The wolves taught me something important about community," Annabelle continued. "They could have seen me as competition for limited escape routes or as prey to eliminate. Instead, they recognized me as another survivor and chose cooperation over conflict. Like what happened when you met Joseph's group," Maria added. "Exactly. I stumbled into their ceremony as an outsider, interrupting something sacred and important. They could have seen me as an unwelcome intrusion. Instead, they recognized someone in need and chose to help." The afternoon class was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Knife, who had become the program's official coordinator and Annabelle's closest friend on the reservation. She carried a folder thick with paperwork and wore the slightly frazzled expression that meant she'd been dealing with bureaucrats, good news and complicated news, Sarah announced as the students packed up their projects for the day. "The Bureau of Indian Education wants to expand the program to 5 additional reservations across the region." This was indeed good news. Recognition from federal education officials meant funding, resources, and the opportunity to help many more people learn adaptive traditional skills. "What's the complicated part?" Annabelle asked. "They want you to travel to each location to train local instructors, 3 weeks at each reservation, plus follow-up visits quarterly for the first year." Annabelle considered this proposal as the students filed out of the cultural center, calling goodbyes and promising to practice their techniques before the next class. The idea of traveling extensively was both exciting and daunting. She had grown comfortable with her routines on the reservation and had developed a support network that made daily life manageable. "What do you think?" Sarah asked once they were alone. "I think it's an opportunity to help a lot more people," Annabelle replied. "But I also think I'd need to make sure each program could sustain itself after I leave. Teaching people to teach these methods, not just teaching the methods themselves," Sarah smiled. That's exactly what Joseph said you'd say. He's already working on a curriculum development plan that would train master instructors at each location. The mention of Joseph brought a familiar warmth to Annabelle's chest. Over the past 6 months, their relationship had evolved from fellow survivors to close friends, to something that felt like it might be heading toward romance, though both of them were taking things slowly. Joseph was dealing with his own adjustments after the fire, the loss of several sacred sites that had been important to his role as cultural keeper, and the challenge of adapting traditional practices to new realities. "Where is Joseph now?" Annabelle asked, meeting with the tribal council about the Medicine Rocks preservation proposal. The fire made the caves more accessible, easier to reach without the dense forest that used to surround the cliff. Council is considering designating the site as a cultural preserve. This was a development that had emerged from their survival story. Media coverage of their dramatic rescue had brought attention to Medicine Rocks as a place of historical and cultural significance. Tourism officials saw potential for educational programs and guided visits, while cultural preservation advocates worried about protecting the sacred nature of the caves. Joseph had been working for months on a proposal that would balance public access with cultural protection, creating opportunities for people to learn about Mandan history while ensuring the caves remained available for traditional ceremonial uses. "Any word on how the council is leaning?" Annabelle asked as they walked toward the parking area, split as usual. The economic development faction loves the idea of cultural tourism bringing revenue to the reservation. The traditional faction worries about commercializing sacred sites. Joseph's trying to find middle ground that satisfies both concerns. Annabelle had learned a great deal about tribal politics during her months on the reservation. Decision-making, processes that balanced competing interests, honored traditional authority structures, and sought consensus rather than simple majority rule, were more complex than the democratic systems she was used to, but often produced more thoughtful and sustainable outcomes. "He'll find a solution," she said with confidence, born of watching Joseph navigate numerous challenging situations over the past months. "He has a gift for seeing possibilities that other people miss." Sarah gave her a knowing look. "Speaking of Joseph and possibilities, are you planning to attend the harvest celebration with him next weekend?" Annabelle felt heat rise in her cheeks. The harvest celebration was a traditional social gathering that included dancing, storytelling, and various activities that served as opportunities for couples to spend time together publicly. Joseph had mentioned it several times recently, but hadn't explicitly asked her to attend with him. "I'm planning to attend," she said carefully. "Whether that's with Joseph specifically remains to be seen." "Uh-huh," Sarah replied with obvious amusement. "You know, for someone who can read complex beadwork patterns by touch, you're remarkably obtuse about reading romantic interest." This conversation was interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. Joseph's pickup truck pulled into the parking area, and Annabelle could tell from the sound of the engine that he was driving faster than usual. Either very good news or very bad news from the tribal council meeting. Joseph emerged from the truck with energy that suggested good news. "They approved the preservation plan," he called out as he approached them. "Unanimous vote after 3 hours of discussion." "What swayed them?" Sarah asked. "Your student testimonials," Joseph replied, looking directly at Annabelle. "The council members were impressed by the stories of people learning traditional skills through the program you developed. They realized that preserving the caves as a cultural site could serve the same function, keeping traditional knowledge alive by making it accessible to people who need it." This connection between her teaching work and the Medicine Rocks preservation effort hadn't occurred to Annabelle, but she could see the logic. Both projects were about finding ways to share cultural knowledge across different groups of people while maintaining respect for its origins and significance. "So what happens next?" she asked. "Development of educational programs that use the caves as a classroom for traditional skills and historical knowledge. Guided visits that combine hiking, climbing instruction, and cultural education. Revenue. Sharing that supports both preservation efforts and community programs." Joseph paused, and Annabel could sense that he was building up to something more personal. "The council also approved hiring a full-time educational coordinator for the Medicine Rock site," he continued. "Someone who understands both the traditional significance of the location and the adaptive teaching methods needed to make the programs accessible to everyone." Sarah laughed out loud. "They're offering you a job, Annabel. Director of Education for the Medicine Rocks Cultural Preserve." The proposal was so unexpected that Annabel needed a moment to process it. A permanent position that would combine her teaching skills with the site where her new life had truly begun. Work that would honor the place that had saved them while helping others learn the traditional knowledge she had come to value so deeply. "What would that involve?" she asked. "Developing curriculum for educational programs at the site, training guides who can work with visitors who have various disabilities or learning needs, coordinating with the cultural center to extend the beadwork program and other traditional skills classes." Joseph moved closer, and she could hear in his voice the careful hope of someone making an offer that meant more than just professional opportunity. "It would also mean staying here permanently," he added quietly, "making this your home in a way that goes beyond temporary work authorization." The invitation carried layers of meaning that went far beyond job descriptions and bureaucratic categories. It was an offer to become a permanent part of the community that had welcomed her, to build a life centered around work that felt meaningful and important. "I accept," Annabel said without hesitation. "Both the job and the life that comes with it." Joseph's smile was audible in his voice when he replied, "In that case, would you like to attend the harvest celebration with me? I know someone who's been hoping you'd say yes to that invitation for weeks now." Sarah laughed again. "Finally, I was beginning to think you two would never figure this out." As they stood in the parking lot making plans for the celebration and discussing the details of Annabel's new position, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The fire that had destroyed her cabin and forced her into the wilderness had seemed like pure catastrophe at the time. Now she could see it as the beginning of the most meaningful chapter of her life. The wolves she had encountered during her escape had taught her that apparent threats could become allies under the right circumstances. The people who had welcomed her into their ceremony had shown her what a community could look like when it was based on contribution rather than pity. The caves that had sheltered them all had become the foundation for work that honored both survival and tradition. Tomorrow, she would begin planning educational programs that would help other people discover their own unexpected strengths. Next weekend, she would dance at a harvest celebration with a man who saw her abilities rather than her limitations. Next month, she would start training instructors to teach adaptive traditional skills across multiple reservations. The fire had taken everything she thought she needed. In return, it had given her everything she hadn't known she was looking for. The morning of the first Medicine Rocks educational program dawned clear and crisp, with autumn air that carried the scent of changing leaves and the promise of winter. Not far behind, Annabel stood at the base of the familiar cliff, checking equipment and reviewing safety protocols with the team of guides she had spent the past month training. "Remember," she told Marcus Yellowbird, a young man who had been one of her first beadwork students and was now her assistant program coordinator, "the climb itself is only part of the education. Every step of the ascent is an opportunity to Share knowledge about traditional uses of plants, geology, wildlife behavior, and survival techniques. The first group of participants was scheduled to arrive within the hour, a mixed group of educators, social workers, and rehabilitation specialists who would be learning both the historical significance of medicine rocks and the adaptive teaching methods Annabelle had developed. If this pilot program succeeded, it would become the model for regular educational offerings at the site. Joseph emerged from the equipment shed carrying coils of climbing rope and wearing the focused expression he always had when preparing for technical challenges. Over the past year, their working relationship had become as comfortable as their personal relationship, each of them understanding the other's strengths and responsibilities without need for lengthy discussions. "Weather looks perfect for the next 3 days," he reported. "No wind, good visibility, and the forecast shows clear skies through the weekend." The 3-day program would take participants through a condensed version of the survival experience that had originally brought Annabelle to this place. They would learn basic wilderness skills, experience the challenge of the cliff climb, spend a night in the caves learning about traditional knowledge preservation, and participate in a ceremony honoring those who had used the caves as shelter. During historical crises, nervous? Sarah asked, appearing at Annabelle's elbow with her usual perfect timing. "Excited," Annabelle replied truthfully. "This feels like the natural next step for everything we've been building." The sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of their first participants. Annabelle listened to the conversations as people emerged from cars and vans, trying to gauge the group's energy and experience level from their voices and the questions they were asking. "Dr. Morrison?" A woman's voice called out. "I'm Jennifer Martinez from the Denver School for the Blind. We've been following your work through the professional journals." Annabelle made her way toward the voice, navigating the familiar terrain with confidence. The title, Dr. Morrison, still felt strange to her. The honorary doctorate the tribal college had awarded her 6 months ago in recognition of her innovative teaching methods and cultural preservation work. But she was getting used to the respect it represented, even if the formal recognition sometimes felt disconnected from the practical work she did every day. "Welcome to Medicine Rocks," she replied, extending her hand. "I'm looking forward to working with your group over the next few days." Jennifer Martinez turned out to be an energetic woman in her 40s who ran adaptive sports programs for visually impaired students. She had brought 3 colleagues from her school, along with 2 students who were training to become peer mentors for newly blind individuals. The rest of the group was equally diverse: occupational therapists from a veterans hospital, special education teachers from rural school districts, a social worker who specialized in helping families adapt to disability, and a documentary filmmaker who was creating a series about innovative approaches to rehabilitation. "Before we begin, the technical aspects of the program," Annabelle announced as the group gathered in a circle at the base of the cliff. "I want to share the story of how this place became significant to our current work." She had refined her telling of the fire escape story over dozens of presentations, but this version would be different. Instead of focusing on the dramatic elements of survival, she would emphasize the skills, knowledge, and community connections that had made survival possible. 18 months ago, I was living alone in a cabin about 15 miles from here, believing that independence meant avoiding dependence on other people. I had spent 3 years proving to myself and others that blindness didn't make me helpless, but I was measuring success by how little I needed from anyone else. The group settled into attentive listening as Annabelle began walking them through the early stages of her escape from the fire, but with a focus on the survival techniques and decision-making processes rather than the life-threatening drama. The key to surviving that first day wasn't bravery or luck, she explained as they began hiking toward the creek that had guided her escape. It was paying attention to information my other senses were providing. trusting that information even when it contradicted what I expected, and making decisions based on actual conditions rather than fear. As they followed the creek upstream, toward the canyon, Annabelle demonstrated the techniques she had used to navigate by sound, smell, and touch. Participants practiced identifying different types of water flow, recognizing the acoustic signatures of various terrain features, and using natural markers to maintain direction when visibility was limited. "This is remarkable," commented Dr. Patricia Hawkins, one of the occupational therapists. "We teach spatial navigation skills in clinical settings, but experiencing them in actual wilderness conditions gives completely different insight into what's possible." The documentary filmmaker Robert Chen was capturing both the practical demonstrations and the participants' reactions. "What strikes me," he said during a rest stop, "is how these aren't really special skills for blind people. They're fundamental, survival skills that anyone could benefit from learning." "Exactly," Annabelle replied. "The techniques I developed for navigating without sight are useful for anyone who might find themselves in low visibility conditions: fog, storms, darkness, smoke. The difference is that sighted people often don't develop these skills because they assume their eyes will always be available." When they reached the canyon entrance, Annabelle paused to let the group experience the dramatic change in acoustic environment. The sound of their voices, their footsteps, even their breathing all changed character as they moved between the narrow rock walls. "This is where I first encountered the wolves," she said, and was gratified to see the immediate increase in attention from her audience. Even in educational contexts, people were drawn to the more dramatic elements of survival stories. But instead of focusing on the danger, she used the wolf encounter to discuss conflict resolution and resource sharing under stress conditions. "The wolves and I were all refugees from the same crisis," she explained, as they made their way carefully through the rocky passage. "We all needed the same thing: safe passage through terrain that offered limited options. Fighting over those limited resources would have wasted energy we all needed for survival." Marcus Yellowbird, who was leading the technical aspects of their passage through the canyon, added his own perspective as they reached the waterfall pool, where Annabelle had first sung to the wolves. "In traditional Mandan culture, we have stories about times when humans and animals had to cooperate to survive great disasters," he said. "These stories teach that cooperation often requires someone to take the first step toward trust, even when the outcome is uncertain." The group spent the rest of the day learning basic rock climbing techniques and safety procedures, preparing for the ascent to the caves that would take place the following morning. As evening approached, they made camp at the base of the cliff, using the same area where Joseph's group had spent their last night in the open 18 months earlier. "Tomorrow's climb will be challenging," Joseph announced as they gathered around the evening fire. "But it's designed to be achievable for people with various physical abilities and experience levels. The route we'll use has been modified to include additional safety anchors and rest points." One of the students from the Denver School for the Blind, a young woman named Ashley Thompson, who had been born blind, raised her hand. "Will I be able to do the technical climbing sections?" "Yes," Annabelle replied without hesitation. "You'll climb rope to an experienced guide who will provide verbal direction for each move, similar to the technique Joseph used to guide me during my original ascent. The rock will tell you where to put your hands and feet if you learn to listen to what you're feeling." Ashley looked both nervous and excited. "I've never done anything like this before." "Neither had I," Annabelle admitted. "But I learned that sometimes. The skills we think we don't have are just skills we haven't had the opportunity to develop." As the group settled into their sleeping bags around the fire, conversations continued long into the night. The teachers and therapists were comparing notes about adapting the techniques they were learning to their professional settings. The Veterans Hospital staff were discussing applications for patients dealing with both physical injuries and psychological trauma. The documentary filmmaker was asking questions about the broader implications of wilderness therapy for disability rehabilitation. What I find most interesting, Dr. Martinez observed, is how this approach flips the usual narrative about disability and risk. Instead of protecting people from challenges, you're using challenging environments to help people discover capabilities they didn't know they had. Exactly, Sarah replied from across the fire. Traditional approaches often focus on what people can't do safely. This program focuses on what people can do with appropriate support and training. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made everyone fall silent, howling from somewhere in the darkness beyond their campfire. Not close enough to represent danger, but near enough to be clearly audible. "Wolves?" Ashley asked with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. "Probably," Joseph confirmed. "They've returned to this area since the forest began regenerating after the fire. We're not in any danger. They're just announcing their presence and checking to see if we're a threat." Marcus got up and moved to the edge of their camp circle. After a moment of listening to the howling, he began to sing, a traditional Mandan song that Annabelle recognized from the ceremony she had interrupted 18 months earlier. The howling stopped, replaced by what sounded like attentive listening. From the darkness, Marcus continued singing, his voice carrying across the canyon in harmonies that seemed to resonate with the rock walls themselves. "Are they responding to the music?" Dr. Hawkins asked quietly. "In a way," Annabelle replied. "They're acknowledging that we're here, that we're not threatening them, and that we're willing to share this space peacefully. It's communication rather than confrontation." When Marcus finished his song, the wolves howled once more, a sound that seemed more like farewell than territorial warning, and then silence returned to the canyon. "That was beautiful," Ashley said softly. "I've never experienced anything like that." "Neither had I, until I found myself in this place," Annabelle replied. "But that's the point of programs like this, to create opportunities for experiences that expand what we think is possible." As the fire burned down and the group prepared for sleep, Annabelle reflected on how much had changed since her own desperate night at the base of this same cliff. Then she had been a refugee fleeing disaster with no clear plan beyond immediate survival. Now she was a guide helping others discover their own unexpected strengths and capabilities. Tomorrow they would make the climb to Medicine Rocks, following the same route that had carried her from crisis to community. But for these participants, the journey would be different. Less about escaping disaster than about discovering possibility, less about individual survival than about collective learning. The howling resumed briefly from a more distant location, as the wolves continued their nighttime travels, but now the sound seemed less like a reminder of wilderness danger and more like a benediction from the place that had transformed her life from isolation to purpose. 5 years after the fire, Annabelle stood at the entrance to Medicine Rocks caves, watching the sunrise paint the recovered valley in shades of gold and green. The landscape bore almost no resemblance to the moonlight devastation she had witnessed from this same vantage point during those first desperate weeks of survival. Where ash and blackened stumps had once dominated the view, a thriving ecosystem now flourished with wildlife populations that exceeded pre-fire levels. "Hard to believe it's the same place," Joseph said, joining her at the cave mouth with 2 cups of coffee brewed over their small morning fire. "Sometimes I think the fire was the best thing that ever happened to this valley," Annabelle replied, accepting the warm cup gratefully. "Not just because of what grew back, but because of what grew up in response to it." Below them, the first groups of the day were already gathering at the base of the cliff. The Medicine Rocks Educational Center had become so successful that they now ran programs year-round with waiting lists that stretched months into the future. What had started as a small pilot project for rehabilitation professionals had expanded into a comprehensive wilderness therapy program that served everyone, from troubled teenagers to corporate executives learning team-building skills. The center's success had brought changes to the entire region. The tribal college had established a degree program in adaptive outdoor education. The State Tourism Board had designated the area as a cultural and environmental heritage site. Most importantly, unemployment on the reservation had dropped to its lowest levels in decades as people found work in education, guiding, equipment manufacturing, and hospitality services. "The documentary premieres tonight," Joseph reminded her. "Are you ready for that level of attention?" Robert Chen's film about the Medicine Rocks program had been accepted into several major film festivals and was scheduled for broadcast on a national nature documentary series. The attention would likely bring even more demand for their programs, but it would also mean dealing with media scrutiny and public expectations that sometimes missed the deeper purposes of their work. As ready as anyone can be for having their life turned into entertainment, Annabelle replied, with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. At least Robert focused on the educational aspects rather than just the survival drama. A familiar voice called up from the base of the cliff, interrupting their conversation. "Dr. Morrison, ready for today's challenge?" Annabelle smiled, recognizing the voice of Dr. Elena Vasquez, a psychiatrist from Seattle who was participating in an advanced instructor training program. Dr. Vasquez had been coming to Medicine Rocks for 2 years, gradually working her way through increasingly complex certifications that would allow her to develop similar programs in the Pacific Northwest. "On our way down," Annabelle called back, then turned to Joseph. "Ready to show another group of experts that they don't know as much as they think they do?" Today's program was special, a gathering of professionals from across North America who had been implementing variations of the Medicine Rocks model in their own regions. They were here for advanced training in techniques that could only be learned at the original site, but also to share innovations and adaptations they had developed for different populations and environments. The descent from the caves had become as routine for Annabelle as walking across her living room, but she never lost appreciation for the technical challenge it represented. The route down the cliff face required the same skills as the ascent: careful attention to foot and hand placement, trust in safety equipment, and the ability to move confidently through space without relying primarily on vision. At the base of the cliff, she was greeted by a dozen professionals representing programs in locations as diverse as the Appalachian Mountains, the Canadian Rockies, urban rock climbing gyms adapted for therapeutic use, and even a modified version being developed for use in Australian Aboriginal communities. "The question we keep running into," Dr. Vasquez explained as the group settled into their morning circle, "is how to maintain the cultural authenticity of what you've created here while adapting it to very different cultural contexts." This was, indeed, the central challenge facing programs that tried to replicate the Medicine Rocks approach. The combination of wilderness skills, cultural education, and adaptive techniques worked here because it grew organically from the specific history and geography of this place. Transplanting it to other locations required careful attention to local cultures, environments, and needs. "Tell me about the specific challenges you're facing," Annabelle replied, settling cross-legged on the ground in the center of the circle. Dr. Michael Brooks, who was developing a program for urban youth in Detroit, spoke first. "We don't have wilderness access like you do here, so we're adapting the techniques for use in urban environments, abandoned buildings, industrial ruins, places where kids might actually find themselves needing survival skills." "That sounds perfect," Annabelle said. The specific environment matters less than the learning process. What survival skills are most relevant to urban situations? Navigation without GPS, finding safe shelter, identifying trustworthy people versus potential threats, resource management when you don't know where your next meal is coming from, Dr. Brooks listed. A lot of our kids are already survival experts, but they've never thought of their street skills as transferable knowledge. Sarah Knife, who had driven up from the reservation for this training session, nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right approach. Honor the skills people already have while helping them see new applications. The conversation continued as other participants described their adaptations. A program in rural Alaska that focused on traditional Inuit survival techniques. A modified version being used with refugees who had survived dangerous journeys to reach safety. An adaptation for elderly people learning to navigate the challenges of aging and potential vision or mobility loss. What we're really teaching, Annabelle observed, isn't wilderness survival or rock climbing or even traditional crafts. We're teaching people to recognize their own adaptive capacity, their ability to learn new skills, trust unfamiliar sources of information, and find solutions to problems they've never faced before. Dr. Vasquez pulled out a notebook and began scribbling notes. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. We've been struggling to articulate why these programs work, when similar outdoor education programs often don't produce lasting behavior change. Because most outdoor education programs are about conquering challenges, Joseph added, settling beside Annabelle on the ground. Climbing the mountain, surviving the wilderness, proving you're tough enough to handle difficult conditions. That's not what we do here. What do we do here? Asked Dr. Jennifer Reyes, who was adapting the program for use with veterans dealing with PTSD. Annabelle considered the question carefully before answering. We create conditions where people discover they already have more skills and strength than they realized. The external challenges, the cliff climbing, the survival techniques, the night in the caves, those are just tools to create situations where people have to trust abilities they didn't know they possessed, like singing to wolves instead of fighting them, Dr. Brooks said with understanding. Exactly. When I found myself surrounded by wolves in that canyon, I had a choice between conflict and communication. I chose communication not because I was brave, but because conflict felt impossible and communication felt like the only option left. Marcus Yellowbird, now the center's full-time program coordinator, gestured toward the cliff above them. Every person who climbs to Medicine Rocks faces moments where they have to choose between panic and problem-solving, between giving up and finding another way forward. Climbing is just the vehicle for creating those choice points. The group spent the morning practicing advanced rope techniques and safety procedures, then moved on to more complex navigation exercises that challenged even experienced outdoor educators. But the afternoon was devoted to the aspect of the program that participants consistently rated as most valuable: learning to adapt traditional craft techniques for people with various disabilities and learning differences. In the Cultural Center workshop, Annabelle demonstrated advanced beadwork patterns that required no visual input, pottery techniques that relied entirely on touch and sound, and weaving methods that could be learned by people with limited fine motor control. But more importantly, she showed the participants how to teach these techniques to others. The key is patience with the learning process rather than focus on the final product, she explained, as Dr. Vasquez struggled with a complex star pattern that had been frustrating her for months. Feel how the beads want to align with each other. Don't force the pattern. Let it emerge from the materials. Dr. Vasquez paused her work and looked up with sudden comprehension. This is the same principle you apply to working with people, isn't it? Don't force them into predetermined patterns of behavior change. Let their strengths emerge from the challenges. Now you're getting it, Sarah said approvingly. Traditional teachers understood that every student learns differently, and the art of teaching is creating conditions where each person's natural learning style can succeed. As the afternoon progressed, the workshop filled with the comfortable sounds of people absorbed in creative work. The soft clicking of beads, the whisper of thread through cloth, the occasional murmured conversation as participants shared techniques and problems solved together. Ashley Thompson, the student from the Denver School for the Blind, who had participated in that first educational program years earlier, had returned as a newly certified instructor preparing to establish a similar program in Colorado. She was working with Dr. Reyes on adapting beadwork techniques for veterans whose hand tremors made conventional fine motor activities impossible. The tremors actually help with certain patterns, Ashley explained, guiding Dr. Reyes through a technique that used irregular bead placement as a design element rather than fighting against it. Instead of seeing the shaking as a limitation, we can use it as a creative force. Watching Ashley teach techniques she had once struggled to learn herself, Annabelle felt the deep satisfaction that came from seeing knowledge truly passed forward. The girl who had been nervous about her first rock climb was now confidently preparing to lead others through similar challenges. As evening approached, the group gathered for the final element of every Medicine Rocks program, a ceremony in the caves that honored both the historical significance of the site and the personal growth each participant had experienced during their time there. The climb to the caves in gathering darkness was now routine for Annabelle, but she never lost appreciation for the transition from the everyday world below to the sacred space above. The caves had been modified over the years with discrete improvements, better ventilation, safer pathways, emergency communication equipment, but they retained their essential character as a place set apart from ordinary time and concerns. In the main cave chamber, lit by carefully placed lanterns that created dancing shadows on the ancient walls, the group formed the same circle that had welcomed Annabelle during her own first desperate night in this place. But tonight, instead of refugees fleeing disaster, they were educators and healers preparing to carry new knowledge back to their own communities. Joseph began the ceremony with songs in the Mandan language, his voice echoing off stone walls that had heard similar songs for centuries. Then Sarah spoke about the historical significance of Medicine Rocks as shelter during times of crisis, and the responsibility that came with learning skills that might someday save lives. When it came time for participants to share their reflections on the program, the responses revealed how deeply the experience had affected people who were already experts in their professional fields. I came here thinking I would learn some new techniques to add to my existing programs, Dr. Vasquez said. Instead, I learned that everything I thought I knew about resilience and adaptation was incomplete. This place teaches you that strength isn't about being invulnerable. It's about being responsive to changing conditions. Dr. Brooks nodded agreement. What struck me most was realizing that the kids I work with are already survival experts. They've developed incredible adaptive skills for their environments. My job isn't to teach them new survival skills. It's to help them recognize the skills they already have and see how those skills apply to new situations. One by one, the participants shared insights that went far beyond professional development. They talked about personal fears they had confronted, assumptions they had questioned, and capabilities they had discovered in themselves during the challenging 3 days of programming. As the ceremony drew to a close, Annabelle found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, she had been a woman fleeing a burning cabin with nothing but survival instincts and the clothes on her back. Tonight, she was surrounded by people from across the continent who were carrying her innovations back to their own. Communities, multiplying the impact of lessons learned in crisis and catastrophe. Before we close, she said, rising to address the group, I want to share something that I've learned from 5 years of running programs like this one. The cave fell silent, except for the distant sound of wind through stone passages. The fire that brought me to this place took away everything I thought I needed to prove my independence and competence. My cabin, my possessions, my carefully constructed life as someone who didn't need help from anyone else. She paused, looking around the circle at faces illuminated by lantern light. What I learned in these caves, surrounded by people who welcomed a stranger in crisis, is that real strength isn't about not needing other people. Real strength is about being someone other people can count on when they need help. It's about building communities where everyone's capabilities are valued and everyone's limitations are supported. Joseph reached over and took her hand, a gesture that represented not just personal affection, but recognition of partnership in work that had grown far beyond what either of them could have imagined. The programs you're taking back to your communities aren't really about wilderness survival or adaptive crafts or even overcoming disabilities, Annabelle continued. They're about creating conditions where people discover they have more to offer than they realized, and where communities become stronger by including everyone's contributions. As the group prepared to leave the caves for the final time, Annabelle remained behind for a few minutes of solitude in the place that had transformed her life. The same spring that had provided clean water during their desperate weeks of shelter still bubbled from the cave walls. The same stone surfaces that had protected them from fire and smoke still rose around her with timeless solidity. But everything else had changed. The terrified woman who had first taken shelter here had become someone who helped others discover their own unexpected strengths. The isolated individual who had measured success by how little she needed from others had become the center of a network that connected communities across multiple continents. Tomorrow, programs inspired by medicine rocks would be serving people in dozens of locations, each adapted to local needs and cultures, but all sharing the fundamental insight that crisis could become an opportunity when met with community support and recognition of everyone's potential contributions. The fire had taken everything she thought she needed. In return, it had given her everything she hadn't known she was meant to become. As Annabelle made her way down the familiar cliff path for what might be the last time before winter weather made the caves inaccessible, she carried with her the satisfaction of work that honored both survival and service. Above her, the Medicine Rocks caves settled into darkness, ready to shelter the next group of people who needed to discover what they were capable of becoming. Below her, lights from the expanding educational center twinkled like stars, evidence of a community that had grown from tragedy into something that served far more people than had ever been touched by the original disaster. The wolves howled somewhere in the darkness, their voices carrying across a valley that had died and been reborn stronger than before. And Annabelle smiled, knowing that she had found her way home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.